Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Audit Committee meeting. And welcome to Karina, who will take us through the first quarter audit status report.
All
welcome,
right.
Ms. Tasker.
Good afternoon, everyone. So in today's report, I'm going to be taking you through 4 different reviews that I've completed recently, specifically the Fire Administration Division, Bylaw Enforcement, SAP User Access, and Kitchener Utilities. Also in progress right now are the Winter Maintenance Comprehensive Review and a Value for Money audit of the Consultants and Professional Services. So both of those will come back to the June Audit Committee. So first up is our process and capacity review of the Fire Administration Division, which was done by myself and Kathleen Woodcock. This review was requested by Fire Administration Division because they were experiencing an overwhelming amount of workload and wondered if their processes could be streamlined. They also wanted to look at optimizing the distribution of tasks between the 5 admin staff within the division, since the excess workload was currently concentrated in 2 of those 5 roles. Conducting this workload analysis of the admin division is one of 35 strategic and operational actions in the Fire Master Plan and was the catalyst for this lean process review. So in order to do this review, we reviewed relevant internal documents for context, including the job descriptions of all 5 positions. We met with all 5 admin staff and their internal customers, which included the fire chief, the deputy chiefs, other management, platoon chiefs, and assistant platoon chiefs through a series of workshops and interviews. We did a lean process review of 17 of their selected admin processes, which included current state analysis to identify sources of waste, problem statements, and root causes, a future state mapping to identify and quantify potential solutions, some implementation planning, and 3 rapid improvement events which dedicate time to implement solutions. And finally, the review also included a workload and capacity assessment in order to determine the current and future demand and resources needed. So due to time constraints, we weren't able to review all of the admin processes with staff. We did, however, work on 17 selected processes, with the goal being that staff can use the skills that they learned through this review to look at the remaining 32 processes themselves. And this was a very successful lean review, and staff are to be commended for their participation and the enthusiasm that they showed through this process. As we mapped out the current state process steps for each of the 17 selected processes, we were able to identify 49 process steps which were considered to be non-value add. And what this means is that the process step either didn't provide value to the end customer, it isn't being done right the first time, or in other words, there's rework that's required, and or the step does not transform the process or service in some way. So those are the criteria for something to be non-value add. So we analyzed the root cause for those 49 non-value added steps and then brainstormed how we might eliminate them. We came up with 139 different solutions, which ranged from easy to hard to implement and had impacts ranging from low to high. And since so many solutions is a little overwhelming to tackle all at once, what we did was then prioritize the solutions based on the ease of implementation and the impact. From there, we chose 3 processes to jump right in and start implementing the solutions through rapid improvement event workshops. And these were very successful and showed staff that by simply carving out some time to dedicate to implementing solutions and improvements, we can progress quickly. It doesn't need to be a long, drawn-out project. This process empowered staff to just do it and implement incremental improvements that will make their processes more efficient and improve customer satisfaction. Overall, all of the identified improvements will save the division 135 hours per year, which is a great first round of lean improvements. So our recommendations to the admin team really focus on making sure that this doesn't die and that they keep it alive and encourage a culture of continuous improvement. Management should monitor the agreed upon implementation plan and hold staff accountable to ensure the improvements get made and that they're sustained. They should communicate progress and make sure that staff feel that they have time and permission to work on implementation. And once the majority of the solutions are implemented or underway, the team can then turn their minds to begin to review the remaining 32 processes over time. Staff and management should continue to recognize each other for their efforts, and they should share their success stories within fire and with the rest of the corporation. The next piece of the review was to compare the current staff available time to the demand for service in order to ensure that workload is distributed evenly across all 5 roles. We were also able to use the data to then predict future impacts of the process improvements, some service enhancements, and some system upgrades that are pending, and what that impact will have on their capacity going forward. So in order to calculate capacity, we look at the amount of time that staff are actually at work, and this is calculated based on a 7-hour workday, less their actual vacation time, some estimated sick time, holidays, and the floater. We then subtract the time that is required to complete all of the work. So during the lean review, staff estimated the amount of time to complete each task and the frequency that they were done over the course of a year. And this was all done at a high level for all of the processes, not just the 17 that we reviewed in detail. Once you subtract the time required to complete the work, you end up with either a surplus or a deficit of capacity. Our analysis for the fire admin capacity shows that currently they have a deficit of about 705 hours per year, or roughly half of an FTE. This is concentrated mostly in 2 of the 5 positions. Currently, this deficit is being addressed through 409 hours of paid overtime, as well as an additional 487 hours of unpaid time spent working through lunches and breaks in order to get the work done. Now, this pace is not sustainable in the long term, nor is it fair to staff. Next, we look at what the future holds in terms of the demand for the work. And there are a number of things that will either add or take away from the current workload. So first, when the new records management system is implemented this year, it will remove the technical support task that admin currently provides for the current system. And this is about 116 hours of work. Technical assistance with the new system will now reside with fire IT support. Along with the new system, the attendance management program that it supports will be refined, which may yield some other time savings. Now, unrelated to this review, the admin team has also just recently stopped providing statistical support to the City of Waterloo, which equates to another 114 hours per year of savings. We've also already noted the 135 hours of time savings that will be achieved if the solutions generated through this review are implemented. However, that only scratches the surface, as there are still 32 processes to be reviewed. So there are likely more improvements and savings to be discovered. And finally, there is a need to enhance service by adding in admin support for 2 programs which currently do not have any support, namely public education and emergency management. Although it's still uncertain what specific support will be required, we've estimated that it will consume approximately 260 hours per year, which is similar to other fire programs that currently receive admin support. So as you can see in the chart, while some of the changes will create capacity, the division is still sitting in a deficit position with enough extra workload in the short term for another part-time person. However, it's yet to be seen what additional savings can be found through the lean review of the additional processes and what the system changes will hold in store. So what we're recommending is that in order to alleviate workload and stress for staff in the short term, that a part-time temporary role be hired for 18 months. This will allow staff to continue to focus on implementing the lean improvements and provide some stability during the system implementation. Now, we've also worked at realigning some of the tasks between the roles to group like tasks together and to spread out the workload evenly. During this time, it's expected that overtime, either paid or unpaid, will not be required and should not be approved by management. And we anticipate that the process and system improvements will make this extra resource unnecessary after the 18-month period, and that workload can be managed by the 5 existing staff. So in conclusion, this review was about enhancing the efficiency of the admin processes and providing more value to their internal customers. They aren't done yet, though. There's still potential for additional improvements related to the remaining 32 processes that have yet to be reviewed and the expected efficiencies from the new records management system. So staff are encouraged to embrace the culture of continuous improvement to move this forward. Are there any questions on this review?
There are. Thank you. Councillor Yanetsky.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I'm a little puzzled, and I've worked with the fire department too back in my earlier years to some degree. What do you mean, and I'm just trying to understand maybe through maybe some examples, lean implementation plan?
So for all of the 17 individual processes that we reviewed, we came up with a number of solutions of how to get rid of those non-value added tasks. So the implementation plan is what do they need to do to get rid of those? So it may be writing a new process, it may be just stopping doing something, it may be communicating to others what their process actually is so that their customers know how to utilize the service that they provide, things like that.
So if you're finding that there's maybe redundant but not value type processes, are these processes then eliminated, saying, well, they're not any value, so we don't need them, so we just take them right off the book?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that an entire end-to-end process would be eliminated, but steps within the process. So here's a concrete example. The admin staff take minutes at meetings. They've been writing them, handwriting them, and then transcribing them onto the computer later. So one very easy way to get rid of that non-value added step is to bring a laptop into the meeting and take the minutes real time. So it saves a lot of time when they do that. Right,
and then you can modify that later in terms of fine-tuning it and editing, etc. once you've got the base of it. There's a whole bunch of processes here that you weren't able to identify, yet staff are doing, and then there's reference there to City of Waterloo in terms of working with them, statistical support. How much statistics are involved in being gathered in terms of these processes? Are they all statistical oriented, or like how many, or just a portion? Or
it's just a portion of one person's job that is related to statistical analysis, and I don't know what specific statistics they are collecting because that's not one of the processes that we drilled into, but I know what they were providing for the City of Waterloo was Office of the Fire Marshal's statistics that are required to be reported.
Well, I thought you would go to see what type of statistical processes you're identifying, because, I mean, are you collecting information that is useless information only because it gives you something to do, or are you really doing something because it provides a need in terms of requirement from legislation or anything like that?
Yeah, and that's part of the process that we've taught them to do. So that statistical analysis is one of the 32 that we haven't looked at yet. But we've taught them to look at the process in the eyes of the customer and actually go to who is using the data, who is using the process, the service, what is it that they need out of it, and then make sure that that's what you're providing and that you're not providing something that no one is using.
So who's the customer in general, or specifically maybe? I don't know. You help me out.
A lot of the processes are to support fire management, so the deputy and the chiefs, and some of it is program support, some of it is supporting the fire staff in general, so payroll, expenses, that type of thing.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Gazzola.
You spoke of processes and process steps. Those are two different things, right?
Yes, so your process would be payroll, your process step would be gather the input, type it into the system, pay the employee.
I was surprised to see with 17 processes, 49 non-value-added steps. And you're saying if you eliminate those, you can save about 135 hours, right?
Yes.
So altogether there are 49 processes, right?
No, altogether, so there was the...
You said there were 17 you looked at and 32 you didn't review, so there are 49 processes.
Yeah. But the 49 that you're referring to, the 49 non-value add, is not the same. It's coincidence.
No, I realize that, but I'm setting that aside. There are 49 processes. In 17 of them, you've saved 135 hours. Is it possible you're going to save another 135 hours?
It's possible, yes.
Yeah. Can you tell me how 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 many hours does a person work in a year? How many available hours are there?
On average, about 1,400. So that's after you take off their vacation, an estimate for a few sick days, as well as the stat holidays and the floater.
Okay, I was trying to is it 1,400 hours?
It's about, so
That,
a person is paid for, I believe it's 1,820 hours, but that includes the time that you have for vacation and stat holidays.
okay, because there's just, and that doesn't include, those are total hours, and that doesn't break it down. There's no breakdown between productive and non-productive.
No.
Do you have any idea with an average staff person how many non-productive hours there would be in a year?
I could average and a
guess. Out of that 1,400 hours?
I've tracked my own time before and tracked how much time I spend, getting up and down to go to the printer, doing various things, and it's about 10 to 15%. That's non-productive.
I don't even call that non-productive. That to me, you have to do that. What I'm thinking of, sort of extracurricular activities, other than the job you're hired to do. I find there are an awful lot of extracurricular activities going on, and I'm just curious as to how many non-productive hours that would involve. I guess this doesn't just...
Councillor Gazal, I'm not sure where you're going in relation to this particular issue.
Well, yes, where I'm going is we're looking here at adding staff, and I'm trying to see where there are ways of not adding staff. That's exactly where I'm going. I'm just trying to...
Yeah, it's not something that we tracked in this. It's more of a management observation. If they find that a staff is spending an inordinate amount of time chatting or, not doing their work, that's up to management to make sure that stops. But we took it as how much time is it required to actually do the work? How much time are you actually at work to do that work?
Yeah, where I'm trying to get at is you're recommending hiring a part-time individual, and I'm trying to see if it's possible to complete everything we need to complete without hiring part-time individual, without hiring more staff. You don't believe so, I don't think. Okay, thank you.
Councillor Fernandez.
Thanks. So do we have an understanding of what has caused the increase in workload? Because I remember when our fire chief came and brought forward the fire master plan, my understanding from the plan was that there was additional lean services that they would, lean using, not the lean that you use, but leaner services, there was going to be no need for any additional staff. So where is this additional workload coming from?
I can't answer that. I don't know. It's not something that we discussed in this review. We took a look at what they are doing currently and what work is required.
Okay. So your recommendation is a 0.4 FTE at 14 hours per week. And my understanding was that we were short 602 hours, right? That's what the chart said, 602.5. So would it be a 35-hour work week, or is it a 36-hour work week?
35. So 35. In order to calculate that, I calculated divided by the 1,400 as the average amount of time that you're at work. So. Yeah.
Because when I did the 35 into the 602, that was 17 weeks of work. And then when I took your 14 hours and multiplied that by, let's say, 50 hours per week, it came out to over 700 hours. So are we going to be having somebody working longer than necessary? Is there more hours anticipated in their year of work? Because you're saying for 1 year that we're going to have this person. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm suggesting for 18 months, so that's over the period that they will be implementing their lean improvements as well as the system implementation of the new system. We also have some staff leaves over this period, so we'll be having some temporary staff that are backfilling the leaves. So by the time all the leaves are completed as well, you'll have staff back up to full capacity, and we'll no longer need the part-time position.
Because I'm just wondering if when you have somebody additional working there and sort of picking up the additional work that's there, I'm a little bit concerned that we're going to find out after 18 months that we start to lean on having that additional person. And so the conclusion would be then, well, we actually now find that we need this 0.4 or 0.5 person to fill the gaps of work that is not getting done. Whereas if we say, okay, let's try for a year, let's complete all the reviews, and still see that at the end of all of those reviews that we still need somebody, wouldn't that be a better way of accomplishing what needs to be accomplished?
Mr. Mayor, you wanted to jump in here?
Sure. Through you, Mr. Mayor, I can assure Council that the corporate leadership team has a very strong bias against doing what you're suggesting, Councillor Fernandez. I take it personally that when these positions are tabled as temporary, we hold our staff very strong to that temporary nature. I can tell you that what we're looking at doing is, for 18 months, there's a new body of work that needs to be done, these further lean reviews that will result in ultimate efficiencies. At the same time, we're not going to approve overtime. So while we'll spend some money on this new part-time position, we will save money on the overtime already being done. And so I'm confident that this is an 18-month and we won't be going anywhere beyond that.
Okay. Do we have an understanding of what the overtime cost has been? I mean, I know we did in hours, but I don't know if we did in dollars.
Yeah, 12,800 in extra costs, and the the unpaid is another 14,900. Now we don't pay that out, but just to give you an idea.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. You're right. It was in the report, and I had highlighted it, so I shouldn't have. And the additional staff person. What would the cost of the 0.4% FTE be?
I don't have that figure with me. Sorry, I can get back to you on that.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Councillor Etherington.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Karina, thanks for the report. I think I already heard one of the answers. I was going to ask how long will the additional lean changes improvements take? It's 18 months?
Yeah, so the initial round of implementation is probably over the next 6 to 7 months is the implementation plan, and then they can start looking at the remaining 32 processes.
And the current situation, you are saying that some people are working unpaid, some people working through their lunch hours. Those unpaid payments, what, they're working in the evenings, or what is that?
No, that's working through their lunches and through their breaks, so they have no break throughout the day.
So they take no lunch? Or?
No.
Okay, thanks.
Councillor Marsh.
Thank you. So I just wanted to confirm a couple things. One is just, we don't need a motion, do we, to approve this temporary position? Okay. And also, it's implied that the staff who got into the habit of working overtime and really taking unpaid working unpaid breaks and lunches, that they're dedicated to their jobs and that they are trying to meet the deadlines that they've had set for them or set for themselves. So I just want to ask that staff pass along, that's appreciated, their work ethic, etc., but that we want to create a healthy work environment. I think that's the assumption here, right? So what I also though want to suggest is that if there are hard deadlines that do need to be done, we're not going to have temporary staff people be able to complete work that is requires a long-term organizational memory, etc. So if certain times it's required that certain people take some overtime and then get paid later, lieu time, I don't think we should be dictating right now whether people should have overtime or not. It depends on anyway, I don't want to micromanage, but I just wanted to put that out there that I really don't think that we should have a hard no overtime ever rule if it's required.
Okay, I'll pass that on.
Councillor Gazzola, you had a follow-up question?
Yes, I just heard, did I hear it right that staff can add temporary staff without any approval from council? Did I hear that?
Yes.
Staff, as long as it's within budget, can have the ability to deal with staffing levels. That's been the practice, correct?
Yes, but I didn't realize that they could add staff. Adding temporary help, part-time help is adding staff.
Mr. Chapman, do you want to comment on this?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, your statement was correct. There's a difference between core complement, which is permanent staff, and temporary staff. We cannot add permanent staff to core complement without council approval, and that's been something that's been maintained for a number of years. But as you can appreciate, due to project demands, temporary work, that sort of thing, provided council has allocated the budget for it, we have the ability to add temporary staff from time to time. In this case, we've been paying the overtime from within the budget, and it's proposed that instead of paying overtime to current staff, we would use that budget to hire a temporary staff person for 18 months.
Thank you.
When you're following that principle, wherever it came from, what is, like in this case, we're dealing with 5 people. Okay, is that, can you add to that group of 5, or when you say there's a vacancy, you'll take in the whole city into account?
Mr. Chapman?
Through the chair, I'll try and clarify. Council has set a core complement, which is a total headcount for the corporation. We cannot increase that permanent headcount without council approval. And so through the budget process, you'll see proposals to bring forward additional headcount. From time to time, within certain areas, we will declare a position redundant to meet a need within that area through vacancy management. That's done without increasing headcount. This is a different issue. From time to time, there is a need for projects or for other reasons to bring on temporary staff. Provided it's not adding to core complement, that's something that's within staff's purview.
If you have 5 people on this staff and you add a quarter of a person, that's adding staff.
Mr. Chapman?
Through the mayor, it's temporary and there's budget to provide for that.
Councillor Schneider.
Thank you, Mayor Vivanovic. Just to be clear, from what I'm reading and hearing, that the hiring of this part-time employee for 18 months will allow necessary changes to be implemented that will, in the long term, give us the savings. So it's a short-term position that will allow for long-term efficiencies and savings. Is that correct?
Correct, and an added level of service as well, because throughout this we're proposing to add additional support for the 2 programs that don't currently have support.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Galloway-Seelock.
That's the point that I was hoping to have clarification on, is that we're hiring an 18-month temporary staff person in order to save ourselves money in the long run, to be more efficient, and to allow us to look at all the processes that haven't been looked at to be more efficient.
Correct.
Moving forward. Therefore, it should be cost savings in the long run.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, those are all the questions. Thank you, Ms. Tasker. We'll move on to bylaw enforcement.
All right. So next up is the process and capacity review of the property standards section of the Bylaw Enforcement Division, which was completed again by myself and Kathleen Woodcock. So just to refresh your memories, in 2016, Council had requested a review of bylaw property standards, specifically to look at the impacts of moving to a more proactive enforcement approach. Prior to this review starting, bylaw staff had engaged with residents on their own to obtain their feedback and reported back to Council in June of last year, concluding that adding education about the bylaws and implementing certain changes to the bylaws could provide a better level of service to citizens, and that a patrols-based approach was not needed. So this internal audit, we were directed to continue with our objective review to provide an opinion on the matter. So the original objective of this review was to assess the current capacity of the section and then explore the impact, what the impact would be if a proactive enforcement approach was taken. The scope included just the property standards enforcement section, so you'll hear me use that term throughout this, and that includes a number of different types of complaints which are shown on your screen. It does not include the noise, trails and schools, or parking sections or complaints related to those. So in order to complete this review, we followed a similar approach to the fire admin review. We started off by reviewing relevant internal documents for context, including the job description, council reports, bylaw standard operating procedures, and Amanda data. We met with staff within the division through workshops, and we interviewed all of council. We facilitated a lean process review of the investigations process, which is the main body of work for the officers, and it included current state mapping to identify sources of waste, problem statements, and root causes, and future state mapping to identify and quantify potential solutions. And finally, the review also included a workload and capacity assessment in order to determine current and future demand and resources needed. So an important part of this review was to interview yourselves to clarify what you meant by proactive enforcement in order to map out what the future process would look like and quantify the resources required. We also spoke with staff to hear their opinions. Here are a few of the main findings from that consultation. First, all of you agreed that staff are very knowledgeable and a cohesive team that strive to provide excellent customer service. Staff had voiced a concern at the outset of this review that the current volume of work really prohibits them from a more proactive approach at this time. We found that the majority of council did not, in fact, want a proactive approach where officers would actively patrol neighborhoods looking for violations. You did have several ideas, however, on how staff could be more proactive without doing patrols. So we then discussed these ideas with staff, and they indicated to us that they are actually already doing most of those things in some form or another, and there's a list included in your report. The main purpose in doing this lean review was because we had anticipated needing to increase the service levels in order to implement a proactive approach, and this would take time and resources that we simply don't have. So doing a lean review would help us to quantify how much time it takes to do the process currently, and then identify non-value-added tasks so that could be eliminated to increase their capacity. During the future state mapping, we anticipated mapping out what a proactive approach looked like and what the impact of resourcing would be. Since that proactive approach is actually not recommended, we did not need to do that final step. As mentioned, we mapped out the investigations process, which consumes most of the officer's time. We found that it is a very highly regulated and complex process with many steps, but we only found 4 steps that were actually non-value add. So if you recall from the fire review, what non-value add means is that either the process step doesn't add value to the end customer, it's not being done right the first time, or the step does not transform the product or service in some way. And we did brainstorm solutions and improvements to address these non-value added tasks. However, they yielded very minimum time savings or capacity gains. We did have a discussion, though, on the lack of absence coverage and how that impacts service. So when an officer is away, so they're either on vacation or they're sick or they're at training, their complaints and their open cases in their geographic territory sit idle while they're away. So the team brainstormed several ideas of how they could provide backup coverage when someone is away in order to provide continual service. Staff and management will be further refining their analysis and choosing a coverage model in the near future. The second part of this review, as I mentioned, was to analyze the current capacity to determine if resources are sufficient to support current and future demand for service in the next 5 years. Even without any changes to the service approach, there will still be growth in demand over time. So first we looked at the current service levels. Staff shared that they are able to provide acknowledgement of a complaint usually within 24 to 48 hours, and then a site visit within 24 to 48 hours when possible. Sometimes the workload is a little bit heavy and they're not able to meet that time frame. Service is primarily complaints-based, except for some proactive monitoring in the downtown and Conestoga College areas. As mentioned, we currently do not have absence coverage, so their files will sit until they return. In the future, there are no enhancements to service levels recommended. However, as mentioned previously, there is a desire to provide coverage during absences, which will provide better customer service for their files while they're away. Now, when looking at demand for service, we looked at what the drivers of bylaw complaints are. Now, each type of complaint has different factors, such as weather or police presence or how much education bylaw has done, but a common driver for many of them is population. As population grows, there are more citizens to both commit violations and to complain about them. So it stands to reason that as population grows, so does demand for this service. We also anticipated a growth in demand for services as the city becomes more accessible through the new online portal. So it will be easier than ever for citizens to complain. If we look at the growth in the last 5 years, we see the population grew by 38%, and the number of property standards bylaw complaints grew by 9%. However, headcount in the property standards section only grew by 6% during that same time, which is the equivalent of one part-time position. If we look to the future, population is expected to grow by 22% over the next 5 years. Using regression analysis to extrapolate the data, we predict that bylaw complaints will grow by another 6% during that time. So what does this mean? Now we have to look at the capacity or the available time that they have to do the work to see if it's sufficient to meet this demand today and in the future. So to do that, first we calculated the time required to do the work. So based on the value stream map that we did in the lien review, staff told us that work typically follows one of 4 paths. So either when they show up to visit the site, there is no violation, or there is a violation and the citizen complies within the time frame that they're given. There is a violation and the citizen appeals. Those are for property standards only. Or there's a violation and the citizen does not comply within the time period and the city ends up cleaning up. So staff told us a range of time that it takes to complete each step in the process, and we totaled these times up for each of the 4 different streams and then multiplied by the number of complaints to get the time required to perform the work. Now, it's not quite as simple as that. We actually broke the work down into specific types of violations because they all take a slightly different amount of time. So snow and ice, grass and weeds, all the different types of bylaw complaints. And we calculated a time for each category based on the typical times for each and for each of the 4 streams. So it was quite a complex calculation that we did. The outcome of the analysis shows that in total they have 11,970 available hours. So similar to the fire review, this is based on a 7-hour workday, factoring in their actual vacation allotment, estimated sick time, and the stat holidays in the floater. It also shows that the total time required to complete the work is 18,803 hours per year. So this includes all of those types of complaints as well as the other tasks that they do, such as testifying in court. Now this may be slightly overinflated in that every single case is not going to take the typical amount of time. You're going to have some that are less. But nonetheless, it does show that they have a capacity deficit, or in other words, there's more work than there is staff to do the work, which is played out by that 24 to 48 hour response time. They're not able to get to everything right away. So the deficit equates to roughly 3 3/4 FTE, and as you can see, this only grows over time as we hold staff constant, but we increase demand. Now, if we adjust that downwards for some possible incorrect estimates, so in case staff have overinflated the numbers or some of the cases are not the typical time, we still feel that at least 2 additional FTEs will be required over the next 5 years just to maintain that current response time of 24 to 48 hours. If more staff are not added, they can still do their work. However, you can expect to see that the response time will worsen beyond the 48-hour time frame. And this could lead to more people calling to see why nothing has been done. And this is what we call non-value-added demand, because we end up spending more time dealing and tending with those phone calls of the extra complaints than time being spent on the actual investigations. Now, we did some additional analysis on the data from the past 5 years in Amanda, just to get a feel for where the majority of calls were coming in. And what we found was that there are two types of complaints that take up almost half of the officer's time. And these are related to property standards and zoning complaints. And then if you look at it in terms of sheer number of calls and violations, the top two categories are snow and ice and grass and weeds. So what this means is that if they focus their public education efforts on those four topics in particular, that will have the most impact on decreasing their call volumes and their investigation times. So the only two recommendations coming out of this review are that in order to maintain current service levels, response times within the 24 to 48 hours, that they request an additional 2 staff through the budget process over the next 5 years, and that they focus their public education efforts on the areas that will have the most impact on their capacity. So are there any questions on this review?
We have a whole pile of questions for you. We'll start with Councillor Marsh.
All right, thank you. So this is a unique way to make a recommendation. From my experience, it's just you've spoken to each of the council members, and based on our opinions coming into the questioning, you've come up with a recommendation rather than what we typically do, which is come in and start a discussion and hear each other's opinions and perhaps be swayed by one way or another. And I'm just wondering, what was that? Why is that approach taken in this case rather than discussing whether or not we should take more of a proactive approach?
Well, going into this review, it was assumed that you all did want the proactive approach. That's why I was doing the review in the first place. So my interviews with each of you one-on-one was to determine, what does that look like? What do you mean by proactive? Because it's kind of an ambiguous term. So,
yeah.
And then from there, it was like, based on all of your input, it was most of you did not want to have a proactive approach, so we didn't take it any further than that.
Okay. Well, I was a little surprised, and I guess I was outnumbered. I wanted to see us discuss the option of having a more proactive approach, specifically around repeat offenders of property standards violations. And I would have appreciated the opportunity to discuss it before we. Well, I still think we should discuss it. I think that perhaps there will be an additional opportunity when we talk about snow clearing in June to talk about how do we do this? What are the options? Because we have an obligation to make sure that sidewalks are clear for the people who need to traverse them, whether it's on foot or by wheels. And so I think that when we have those repeat offenders, they don't deserve the same 48-hour grace period or 24-hour. It's essentially 48 hours from the first snowfall. But so I was just surprised by that. And I would like to see a little bit more attention paid to whether or not there would be an option to. I don't think that we would have necessarily an increase in parking complaints if we diverted some of our bylaw enforcement resources from parking to property standards, because a lot of times people complain about us being too on the ball with getting a parking ticket a minute after the time period is over, where if we were able to be a little bit less to the, a little bit less by the book in that regard, I think that we would have more time for property standards. But I guess I should ask a question about that. Is that not a possibility? Maybe I have to ask Ms. McNeil.
If you want to answer, you can. But what staff had told me was that they had tried this in the past where they had split a role between parking and property standards, and that there just wasn't enough time to do both things in a day, to switch between the two different types of enforcement.
Yeah. It was about lot maintenance, not necessarily sidewalk clearing, but yeah. All right.
Okay, Councillor Fernandez.
Yeah, I guess my question is a little bit similar to my colleague. I thought we had hired 2 new bylaw officers a couple of years ago, and correct me if I'm wrong, they were specific to parking. Is that correct? Do you know?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the 2 new bylaw officers were approved by council through budget process were specific to noise bylaws.
Oh, to noise. Okay, and of course this review doesn't cover that. I guess I'm kind of wondering, sort of the similar to what Councillor Marsh was talking about, is that if you sort of do double duty with property standards and parking staff if they're out in the area where property standards have been an issue, and then they're also addressing parking issues. Are they able to view both of those at the same time, or is each bylaw officer working on one specific area and not on the other?
Ms. McNeil?
Through the chair, there's a property standards is highly complex in comparison to parking, so there's not the ability to interchange those 2 roles. There's also a significant difference in pay scale for those 2 roles. The other thing that we do try to do where we can is, if we're able to utilize staff, if we need photographs taken in, after hours where we don't have to have overtime hours used by that property standards officer, we do utilize those staff where we can. But there's not a great opportunity to be able to interchange those 2 roles.
Okay. Would the hours that are required for our bylaw reviewing property standards, for example, in a winter that we don't have as much snow, so they would be focusing on what other areas than sidewalks and ice? So then it would be looking at property standards of properties as opposed to the sidewalk in front of the property?
Through the chair, they do that now, so that role, the snow and ice bylaw, their primary role is snow and ice and lot maintenance. So when they don't have such a busy season doing snow and ice, they are doing other property standard type related calls.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Singh.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just looking at the report, and I agree with the recommendation going forward, and still see caution with the requirement increase in staff going forward in the next 5 years. So I had hoped that there would be more emphasis placed on educating the public. Does that take into consideration, I know through your presentation you touched on it a little bit, is that taking into account that if we were to really have a focused strategy about educating our citizens about our bylaws and proper protocol, that we would still require in the next 5 years the additional 2 FTEs?
Likely, yes. I can't speak to how much an education campaign would decrease the number of calls, but certainly the population is growing, and with that comes an increase in number of complaints.
As part of this review, did we consider looking at some other municipalities, how they have approached, as it was a growing city or with a rapid increase in population, how they've managed to incorporate, instead of just having to, one, proactive enforcement with hiring a lot more FTEs, or again, requiring to meet the demand of additional FTEs with increased population growth. Did we look at it as an examples with other municipalities?
No, we did not do benchmarking as part of this review.
There's some, services that are, I wouldn't say shared, but in cooperation or joint agreement with our neighboring municipalities. Is bylaw one of them where we could utilize? They have bylaw staff, we have bylaw staff. When they don't, they have downtime, or they don't have, where we can, take on their services and vice versa, back and forth. Is that ever a consideration?
It's not something that we considered in this review, but Gloria, do you have
Is it something we've ever looked at in the past? A joint cooperation? Because again, we, especially with the city of Waterloo as a joint city, we have a long border, and so it's kind of porous. Is there any Would there be any advantage in some sort of consideration on that front?
Through the chair, that's not something that we have looked at. I know in speaking with Waterloo, they're having the same challenges, and they have a residential licensing bylaw, which is even more complex than anything that we have in place right now. So that's not a discussion that we've ever had.
But in future reviews, that may be something that we may consider looking at?
Through the chair, we'd have to certainly speak with Human Resources about that, because we are in a unionized environment, so I'm not sure how that would play out.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Councillor Galloway-Seelock.
Yeah, first question is talking about the additional 2 staff over the next 5 years. That would come through the budget process then, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And was there, I didn't see in the report, but was there any consideration in how many more staff we would need if we went and increased the service level to 24 hours versus 24 to 48?
Sorry, increase the
service level?
To be less than the 24 hours, you mean?
Just to meet the 24. So instead of it being in the 24 to 48 category, it's, 0 to 24.
No, we did not look at that. But we have all of the data now that we can show how much each step in the process takes and how many complaints of each type we have.
So would that be an easy enough number for you to get? Just what would the additional staff look like if it was a 24-hour response period?
I can work with bylaw and try to figure that out. Yeah.
Okay. That's all my questions.
Councillor Gazzola.
Yeah, I just want to confirm first. So from I'm understanding right, we're just looking at 2 possible staff people. We're not recommending 2 staff people at this time.
No, you're not.
Yeah,
I'm
okay.
recommending 2 staff over the next 5 years, but that's up to staff to bring it through the budget process and for you to vote on.
I'm questioning your standards that you use to arrive at these figures. I'm not saying they're right or wrong, or I do question whether the population is the best standard. You could have a population increase, but really, how many more families is that? Like a family could be 5 people, but you're not going to get 5 times as many complaints. That's just really 1 complaint, right?
Yes, and it wasn't a one-to-one. So when I ran it through a regression analysis, it takes that correlation into account. So as you notice, the population went up by 38 or 39%, and bylaw complaints only went up by 9%. So it's not a one-to-one.
No, and I realize that you're not looking for 30%. I'm just saying though that population, that really sort of throws it way over the top by saying there's a 38% increase in population. What's more relevant to me is the number of new families and the number of new properties that we have. But the other question I have is, do we know, like, different complaints can take much different times?
Yes.
So how can we just say that there are X number of complaints? Is there? Do we know what the total time spent on all the complaints are? The way you're looking at it here, each complaint takes 7.69 hours to
So we did break it down by type of complaint and then the 4 different streams that a complaint could take, and then took from what staff were telling us and from our process mapping, what is the typical time that it takes? Some are going to take more, some are going to take less, but that's for each one of those types and each of the 4 streams.
Are you saying on average it takes 8 hours to deal with a complaint? Those are the figures you've used. I just wonder the necessity of dealing with some complaints in a 24 or 48 or a 96-hour period. If it's a snow complaint, I can see that you have to deal with that quickly. But if it is a failure, something to do with property standards, there's no urgency that needs to be dealt with. Is there in a 24 or 48-hour period?
Looking to Gloria for answer on this one, sorry.
Through the chair, That's a response time that we had set a number of years ago based on complaints that we received. So generally, if somebody calls in a complaint about a deficiency in their unit, we try to be as responsive as we can. We certainly have different criteria that meets we have different response times for. If somebody has no heat, we're clearly getting there within a matter of hours of getting that complaint. There are some that can take longer, but generally what we found was if we tend to wait any longer than that 48-hour period, then we've got people calling back that are frustrated because it's either taking us too long to respond, or if somebody's called in a complaint, they're not seeing any action off of their phone call.
Yeah. But different complaints have different urgencies, and when we get a complaint, can we not? I mean, if it's it could often be a complaint of something that's been going on for years. Can we not say, well, we'll look at that within the next week? That doesn't have to. It's been going on forever. Does it have to be dealt with that quickly?
Through the chair, we absolutely can, but then I think we need to prepare ourselves for the fact that we're going to have more people calling in complaining that our response times are not as quick as they'd like to see.
Well, that I can understand. But if I guess I'm just questioning that there are things that have been going on for years, and they finally call property standards to expect something to be rectified within 24 or 48 hours. I think that's too good a service. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, Councillor Gazzola, I think you're raising a good point, but probably the appropriate time rests in the eye of the beholder on this one, I would think. I mean, there's probably what does the average person, including council, think is reasonable, and then there's probably the complainer who feels it needs to be dealt with in 12 hours or less, and that's partially what we have to grapple with. Councillor Schneider.
Thank you, Mayor Vivanovic. I appreciate the average response time, but I've had situations dealing with tenant occupancy, and bylaw have been amazing in investigating and researching and interviewing. These are things that take quite a long time because they don't have the ability just to walk in and do the count. There's other things now that are coming up, boulevard planning with our neighborhood strategy and Love My Hood, which is going to take up more of their time. So I'm almost concerned that it's not enough staff, because when our constituents call us, they expect a response time and quickly, and any delay in responding and putting something off, there's still going to be complaints coming in during that delay. So, my concern is that we do want to have a great response time and great customer service on that, because to that person who calls in, whether it's a property standard or their neighbor's grass isn't cut, that is of the utmost importance to them. So I'm just concerned that maybe it's not enough staff over the next 5 years to continue the service that we're giving. So I don't know if Gloria has any comment on that about the workload level and the times needed to resolve issues. But I guess on average that might be a number, but in certain cases where one that I've dealt with tenant occupancy and while I was working, it's been way more. It's still ongoing, and it's been going on for 6 months. So it's not really a question, but just pointing
More
that
comment?
out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Councillor Etherington.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, a couple of comments and questions. I'm a great supporter of bylaw enforcement staff, and I have no problem with the 2 extra hires over that 5-year period. But I support Councillor Marsh in that in the downtown wards we have particular issues and headaches with property standards that I would venture that are not that are rarely experienced in most of our other wards. And so I agree with her. I wanted the opportunity on proactive assessment by bylaw staff. I wanted to see that in council, and I wanted the chance to try, even if it was unsuccessful, to persuade fellow councillors. I don't want that issue decided by staff, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I'm a great admirer of our bylaw staff. I just think it should be decided in council. That's on that one issue. On the other issue, I wanted to ask Karina about, or Gloria, one of the two. The population increases that you base this on, surely a large portion of those population increases are likely to be in new buildings, new developments, certainly in the downtown along the LRT route. And in my opinion, you wouldn't be running into as many property standards issues in brand new buildings. I would hope not. So when you look at population, did you take into consideration the population of those new buildings where perhaps we wouldn't run into the kind of work that bylaw sees in other properties?
No, I was basing it on the past 5 years' growth and what correlation that had to bylaw complaints.
Okay, thank you.
So, Councillor Etherington, just to respond to your question of when is the right time to deal with the staffing issue, I would suggest it would be in one of two scenarios. One is sometime in the next 5 years when staff bring forward presumably a request with respect to these two positions. That would be one time, and the other time would be every year at budget time. It's up to any member of council to ask for an issue paper for additional resources in a particular area, and then staff can look at it, and up to council to make the case and see if there's support around the horseshoe for it at that time.
Good point.
Councillor Ioannidis.
Thank you, Mayor Verbanovic, and thanks, Ms. Tasker, for your audit on this particular subject. I guess one of the questions I have is, when you committed this audit, did we ever look at other models from other cities on how they operate their bylaw departments?
No, we have not.
Okay. Did we even look at, let's say, technology like new technologies to offset some of these increases with staff?
Yes, so one of the non-value-added tasks that came out of the process review was related to the paper records that they keep and whether we can automate that. We did quite an extensive analysis on that to say that the pieces of paper that they carry around with them are often found in various different places, and to have that on mobile technology was too difficult to have all the applications and to be able to get the information quickly. So the savings of not having to carry around paper were outweighed by the amount of time searching for data online. So we did look at it.
Okay. Was there any, I know Waterloo has a car or something that does for parking. Did we even look at that at all as part of this process with technology?
Parking was out of scope for this review.
Oh, so parking was out of scope, sorry. Okay. I guess my other question is, because when we look at this analysis, it clearly shows that there's a lack of capacity to complete all the work necessary. So what I'm concerned here is, are we facing like a low morale in this department, or are we facing burnout?
I'll turn to Gloria to answer that, because we didn't talk about that in our sessions.
Ms. McNeil?
Through the chair, I don't believe that we're facing that with this particular group. I think, they're a great group that work well together and support one another. So I think we're in a good place right now. I'm not sure what that'll look like in 5 years if we don't look at increasing staff levels and if the complaints do continue to rise. But for now, I think we're in a good place.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to be going into second rounds. If I can just remind everyone, we're at 5:45 and we still have 2 reports and caucus and 7 o'clock council. So folks can govern themselves accordingly, please. Councillor Fernandez.
Actually, I didn't have too many questions, except that I wanted to know if, similar to what Councillor Etherington was saying, that I think we're going to see a lot more infill with multiple units. And so I wondered if maybe the population growth related to complaints might actually be a little bit different as opposed to single family houses and that kind of growth. Would we be looking at, or my suggestion would be, because I think the service level is important to maintain, and similar to what Councillor Etherington was saying, some issues in my ward have taken months and months and months, and I know bylaw is very dogged in their approach, and they keep at it until they get a resolution, and I really appreciate that service level. Would we consider looking at an additional person, say over the next 2 years, reviewing how that helps our property standards, considering that the growth may be in a different area, in a different manner, and then again maybe another review after those 2 years to see if we need that additional person? I mean, it's hard to know, right, over 5 years what's going to happen.
So you're suggesting a follow-up review within 2 years?
Well, I'm just thinking that I see the benefit to adding an additional person certainly with the population growth in the newer areas, but after 2 years, I think it might be prudent to take a look and say, well, not all of that increased population is in the greenfield areas, but more of it is happening in condos, multiples, apartments, and so we're not seeing the level of property standard complaints, because if you've got 100 people living in an apartment building, they might complain about one sidewalk, but they're not complaining about the lot beside them, kind of thing.
Mr. Mayor?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor. It's a good point, and I think I just want to take us back to what we have today, which is the results of Ms. Tasker's audit, which now Ms. McNeil and myself will go away and look at it, figure out whether it's a phased approach, which I think is what you're suggesting. But there are a whole lot of other things around technology that we need to consider before we make a recommendation to you through future budget cycles.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Gazzola?
Yeah, I don't have any questions. I just want to make a quick comment, and it's a comment I've made with Ms. Tasker every time I see her, and that is on the one-to-one, one-on-one, the process we use of one-on-one. I think Councillor Marsh was sort of tending towards it. I'd like to hear what all the members of council have to say, and when we do one-to-one, we miss out on that, so we don't know where people around the horseshoe stand. So it's something that it's been a common process around the city over the last few years, these one-on-one, but I would prefer, whenever we have issues like that, I prefer to have them in a setting like this so that we can hear what our colleagues, what opinions they have, and if they're different than ours, we at least know who we have to perhaps try to persuade.
Councillor Singh.
Yeah, just a quick comment, Mr. Mayor, and I appreciate the different viewpoints on the best approach to do these reviews, but I just want to acknowledge that sometimes unfairness to staff, we're never happy in what is the best approach. When it is a one-on-one, we acknowledge that perhaps a more public meeting would be more prudent, and when it's a public meeting, a lot of time, because the complexity or the breadth of the topic is so large that you can't necessarily within the time frame get the full nuances of what staff are trying to get at, and then we complain and saying we didn't have enough time. Perhaps a one-to-one would have been more better. All I got to say is I think from my experience in dealing with this, I think it was a good approach. It did give an opportunity to go into a good dialogue, and from what I experienced, I felt staff were taking some of the recommendations as I was giving to heart, and through the report, I felt that. So just want to quickly say, no two wards are the same. There are some wards that do require more attention than others, but at least from my experience, I think with the resources that are in hand, our bylaw department seems to do really well, and it would be my recommendation or my encouragement that we outline a technology as well as additional efficiencies and a more of a phased approach as we increase the complement within that department.
Councillor Galloway-Seelock.
I just want to thank staff for all the hard work that they've done in bringing these forward. I think it shows that a lot of thought and consideration has gone into it, and that you bring forward your recommendation. It's up to us if we don't agree with it or we want to change something in that recommendation to do so by bringing forward a motion whenever we want under new business in council, and try and make those changes and try to convince other members of council to have that debate. And that's the way that we've always done it. So I appreciate staff's energy and effort in bringing these forward.
Okay, that looks like all of the comments. I'm just going to add my own thanks to both the work that our bylaw enforcement staff do day in and day out, week in and week out, because I think, you know, there are obviously a high level of challenges, and they're different in different parts of the city. You know, in some areas it's parking, sometimes it's property standards, sometimes it's something different. And I think staff have done a good job from a resource perspective. I think, Ms. Tasker, I want to also, though, compliment you on the work that you've done on this, because it is difficult to balance sort of all those different feedbacks and viewpoints, whether it's from the staff side, council side, and so on. I don't know if you did it for this particular set. I know at times, I think you have, where council has asked to meet in more than one person. You've facilitated that as well. Obviously keeping it within what's acceptable in terms of the clerk and having more than one person meeting at a time. I do think what's important about this process is, and this is true of our whole internal audit processes, is having the ability for a professional like Ms. Tasker to give it that clear lens and to make recommendations, sometimes that council might not like, sometimes that staff might not like, but to give us that professional opinion. And at the end of the day, it's up to either party or both to mull it over and to either go in that direction, or quite frankly say, for other reasons, we think here's the changes that need to happen. But I think her role is to give us the best technical answer, and then it's up to us to decide where we go from there. So let's move on to SAP user access. And again, just want all of us on council to be cognizant of these next two in terms of time.
I'll try to talk fast. All right, just so by way of background, when we did the comprehensive accounting review a few years ago, we discovered that several SAP users had access to perform all possible tasks within the system, which is a separation of duties, conflict, and a fraud risk. So a recommendation from that audit was that I work with the SAP Business Solutions staff to analyze all of the user access with an initial focus on users that have access to all information. So the objective of this audit was to first determine what combinations of access rights within the system present a high separation of duties conflict, and then determine if staff that have that access actually need it to do their jobs. Depending on the answer, the goal was then to either remove the unnecessary access or mitigate any required conflicts through additional controls and checkpoints. So for the purposes of this audit, a high-risk scenario is defined as when a user has the ability to create SAP transactions that would allow them to either steal money from the city or to misrepresent the corporation's financial situation. The methodology included developing the list of high-risk scenarios through reviewing a standard separation of duties matrix that was provided by the SAP vendor, doing some online research, and referring to the findings from other audits I've done in the past related to SAP transactions. The SAP Business Solutions team then reviewed all of the user IDs against this high-risk scenario list and provided me with a list of the conflicts. We then worked together to determine if the access was actually required and whether it could be removed. So as a result of the previous accounting audit and the recommendation that was made within it, it was found that all of the people that had all access had actually already been removed from everyone except for the SAP Business Solutions and the Technology and Innovation staff team who need the access in order to support staff. It was found, however, that several other users had more access than they needed in order to do their jobs. So SAP Business Solutions staff are now working to remove any unnecessary access. It was recommended that they make sure that their staff are available to support users through this transition, just in case they find out that after access is removed that it's actually required to do the job. One of the findings was about 2 specific generic IDs that the SAP vendor has that is required to provide support to us. So it's also recommended that we have a semi-annual report be run to ensure that the vendor has made no unauthorized changes to our system. Since the SAP Business Solutions and Technology Innovation staff have the all access, it's recommended that they follow the protocol that all other staff do and ensure that they have management approval for any journal entries that they make, and that in order to maintain an audit trail. It's also recommended that a process be created to review a user's access requirements when they change roles. So in the past, no review was done, and so therefore they would move on to their new role and they may acquire additional access, but the old access was never removed. And finally, SAP Business Solutions should run this separation of duties check each year to ensure that there are no new conflicts. Are there any questions on this review?
Okay, thank you. There are some. Councillor Fernandez.
Yeah, thanks, Karina, for this information, because it is a bit concerning that we had users on this SAP. Would you say that the reason, or can you give a reason as to why we ended up with all these unnecessary users on having this access?
So the main reason, 2 main reasons. One is when people change roles, as I just mentioned, their old access was never removed. They were just added on to. Also, when original user IDs were set up, it wasn't clear exactly which pieces of SAP they needed access to, so they were probably granted more access than they actually needed.
Okay. Did we find that any of the risks that you identified, that we experienced any of those risks?
No, there's been no fraud identified.
Okay, all right. I'm glad to hear that you're going to continue with an annual review. I think that's really important, because in a large corporation like this, we have people moving around all the time, so I think that's really prudent. Thank you.
Councillor Gazzola.
Yeah, I think you've answered my first question. Was, are we aware of any problems in the past?
No.
It's not been an issue.
No.
Yeah, the other question I wondered, I'm sure our external auditors are concerned about this. Do they look at this? Do we know whether they look at this or not, or have they ever had any comments about it?
I don't know if they look at it or not.
Okay, I would hope they do. Okay.
Mr. Chapman?
Through the chair, they're required to assess fraud risk as a part of the annual audit, and I think they've largely satisfied themselves in the past based on the controls outside of the system that protect against fraud risk in the financial statements. But as you've pointed out many times, materiality is also a consideration for them, and so it might not pick up lower level risks, which this will.
Yeah, just one thought. When we're talking about SAP people, these are all city staff people. They're not provided by the manufacturer. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, those are all the questions on that one. Right. So we'll move on to the last one, Kitchener Utilities.
All right, so this is the final item, and it's a risk assessment which was done by myself and Alicia Bennett. The objective of this assignment was to facilitate a risk assessment with Kitchener Utilities Division to help them identify and assess all of the risks that could stop them from meeting their business goals and objectives. I'd just like to remind all of you that a risk assessment is a planning exercise, and the act of identifying risks does not mean that something bad is going to happen. It's simply a business tool to help us proactively list the things that could go wrong and then put actions in place to make sure that they don't happen. So Kitchener Utilities is not new to this process, as they did have a risk assessment done in 2010, which was monitored and actioned for about 2 years after that. The gas and water industries are inherently risky, and therefore it made sense to refresh the risk assessment to get a picture of the current risks that the division is facing. The work will also help the new director to prioritize where he needs to focus his efforts and where further process reviews are required. As with any risk assessment that we've done in the past, we interviewed a sample of staff and management to get their input on the risks that they see in their business. Now, new this time, we also interviewed a sample of stakeholders, including revenue, supply services, engineering, GIS, support services, and financial planning, to get their input on risks that could impact either Kitchener Utilities objectives or stakeholder objectives. So we feel that this approach gives a more comprehensive review of the risks that are caused by Kitchener Utilities' business that could impact either the unit itself or other stakeholders. We then facilitated a workshop with both staff and stakeholders to jointly come to consensus on the likelihood of a risk happening and the impact if they did occur, using the corporate risk rating and categories. The outcome is that Kitchener Utilities now has a prioritized list of risks. What we found, though, was that there were two main underlying issues which gave rise to many of the risks on the list. First was that there are staff shortages in many of the roles, as staffing has not kept pace with population and customer growth. And second is that the data that staff rely on to do their work, such as maps of the infrastructure, are often out of date because staff have not had time to input the updates. So if Kitchener Utilities can resolve these two issues over time, then many of the other risks will diminish in likelihood of occurrence. In terms of next steps, the list of risks will be used, as I mentioned, to allow the division to focus their efforts on the highest risk items and prioritize processes for deeper review. These reviews may be requested through our service review work plan, or they could be conducted by staff themselves as desired. Staff will work to create treatment plans for each of the high risks, which could involve either avoiding the risk altogether, reducing it, transferring it to a third party, or accepting the risk. Management will monitor the status of the risks and ensure that the appropriate mitigation plans are in place. Are there any questions?
Okay, we do have some questions. I guess all in all, this one's to say it's a work in progress. Councillor Gazzola.
Are we aware of any problems in the past concerning this, relating to this issue?
Which issue is that? Just the risks in
general?
general?
I mean, that there are a lot of risks, that's, but if we, have any of them materialized?
Not that I'm aware of. They've been, all the ones that were identified in 2010 had been monitored and mitigated through that time.
Okay, the other question I have, you talk about data being out of date. Can you just give us a little more detail on that? I don't know, what type of data is out of date?
Some of their infrastructure maps that they have, that they use to do any variety of work within the division. That's one of the staff shortages is in the role that does the data input into the system. So they're quite far behind on keeping the maps up to date.
And how does that affect them?
They need to know where the infrastructure is in order to work on it.
If it's broken?
Yeah, if they're doing repairs or reconstruction or any type of work.
Thank you.
Councillor Fernandez?
Yeah, I just wanted to address that because we've been collecting data for a long, long time, and I do have concern that if we're collecting the wrong data or the data is not being inputted correctly, that we run the risk when work is being done on our streets that we're going to hit utilities that shouldn't be hit. How are we? What are we doing to mitigate this?
That will be something that the director will need to look into to see how are we going to resource that to get rid of the backlog of data input. So okay. That's the benefit of doing a risk assessment, is to prioritize those things for action.
Okay, all right. I'm hoping that further information is going to come to council in the near future on this.
Councillor Marsh?
Yeah, just as a follow-up to Councillor Fernandez's question, normally, Ms. Tasker, you give great recommendations out of your audit reviews, and I'm just wondering why is it that we don't see any of your recommendations and it's just being left to management to just determine the next steps?
So this was not an internal audit. This was a facilitation of a risk assessment. So this was just helping them to collect this list of risks and to be able to prioritize them.
Okay, right. So then are we doing an internal audit? Is that scheduled for Kitchener Utilities in the near future? Can you remind me?
Yeah, so management will take this list of risks and they'll go through particularly the high risk ones, and they'll determine which ones require, for example, a process review or things like that. And that will come back as a request to me.
Every year you come forward with a list of the priorities, and yep. I remember seeing Kitchener Utilities on that list, but is it not scheduled for 2018 to do a internal audit review of?
This is what was scheduled.
This
So
is what was scheduled.
The risk assessment is the first step. Sometimes when we do comprehensive reviews, we do the risk assessment as part of the comprehensive review and then go into the audit piece of it. In this case, because Kitchener Utilities is such a large division with the gas and the water sides, we determined that we would start with the risk assessment and then from there prioritize what areas do we want to do a review on, because it will be overwhelming to do a review of the entire division at once.
Understandable. So I guess what I'd like to ask is if we can have a report to council, whether it's through an email or something less formal than an official report, just to give us an update from the Director of Utilities as to what the next steps are in mitigating risk.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, that appears to be all the questions on this one. So, is there anything else, Ms. Tasker?
No, that's it.
If not, thank you. As always, you do a whole lot of great work with not a lot of people power. And so, while you're obviously get supported with info from around the organization, that probably only adds to your workload, but it helps you get the job done. So thank you to you, and thank you to everyone who cooperated with you in completing this piece of work. Motion to adjourn. Councillor Schneider, Councillor Fernandez, all those in favor, opposed?